everyone, welcome to our very special surprise stream. Usually not here on a Monday. We're Revolution Software, an indie dev studio based in York, and you might know us best from the infamous Broken Sword games, but today we're celebrating something very different, something a little bit more classic, shall we say. Yeah, why don't we introduce ourselves? Why don't we start with Charles?
Yeah, I was the game director of the original Beneath the Steel Sky, and I wrote the story and designed the puzzles, and had the great pleasure of working with Dave on the title.
That's me. So I'm Dave Gibbons. I'm a comic book artist and writer, and I've been the art director, and I've done lots of designs both for the first game, Beneath the Steel Sky, and for Beyond the Steel Sky.
Oh, sorry. I already see that a lot of people have looked at what is happening already. Yeah, so today we pressed a button on something really cool. But this is not my news to share, so I'll let the boys take it away from me.
Right. Well, no, the exciting news, which is only little news, it's not earth-shattering, is that we have Beneath the Steel Sky coming on Steam for free. And it will be available, I believe, at British summertime, 7 o'clock, which translates wherever you are in the world. I think East Coast, 2 o'clock, and California, for all you wonderful Californian people, I would guess would probably be 11 o'clock, so in the morning. So anyway, the game is coming out and we're really excited because there's so much love. And basically we wanted to celebrate this by just really talking, Dave and I were talking a little bit earlier about what we should, some of the anecdotes. And actually, while a number of them have been talked about before, more than once, actually, hopefully there's some new ones as well. So for people who are interested in the original game, indulge us if you don't mind. We'd just love to talk a little bit about how it all happened, and reminisce and just have some fun.
Absolutely. I do love me a good anecdote. And in previous live chats like this, we've told a few of the anecdotes, but as Charles said, there's always one anecdote more. So I'll let him set the agenda, and then I'll just jump in with an anecdote whenever one occurs to me.
Brilliant. So, Dave, we've often said that we first met when I'd approached you to find out whether we could license the rights to Watchmen, and I thought it might be fun to go back to the Activision days, because you actually drove to Activision when we were based in Reading, didn't you?
I seem to think so. I've got the memory of this rather large kind of office. And it was not as, my memory is that it's not like a games company office as you see them nowadays, where it's absolutely crammed with computers and people. It was kind of a biggish office with some biggish kind of computers in it, but a very kind of almost like it was an accountant's or something like that. It felt quite respectable. I mean, which isn't an adjective that I would normally apply to the people I've met in the gaming world. And I remember having a chat with you and having to tell you that, probably the rights to Watchmen weren't available, or if they were, it would be a long negotiation with DC Comics. But I think we sort of, from the very beginning, kind of got on with each other. And there were lots of kind of Watchmen related inquiries back in those days. And after we said goodbye, I thought, oh, well, that was interesting. I don't think anything's ever going to come of it. But then things moved on, and you ended up being a director of your own company, Revolution. I think it was at that point that you approached me again. And I can't remember much about that second meeting, but maybe you can.
So I do remember the first one. When before I joined Activision, Noreen was at Activision, and they had beautiful offices in Pond Street in Hampstead, and they really loved it. And then, as was the way in the 80s, it got moved to the M4 corridor. And the reason given was so that when Americans came, they'd land in Heathrow and they could get to the office quicker, which I always thought was rather a bad reason to go to a place like that. And it was actually in Reading, just on the outskirts, a place called Whitley. and it was quite close to a sewage plant. So there was the smell of sewage, and Activision in the US was in the process of going bankrupt. So it was all a little bit of a depressing time, but it gave the opportunity for, Revolution really sprang out of the ashes, as is often the case, because when companies go bankrupt, often lots of experienced people are then released that can then go and create new companies, and that's really what Revolution did back in 1990.
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting to think that it was to save the Americans the long drive from the airport, because in my experience, even a long way in England isn't very far to an American. So,
No, I know, but I'll tell you a fun story, and that is that I had my boss Rod Cousins, his boss Jeff Mulligan was this Californian that was so well regarded, and he married the president's niece or something, and he was legendary. But he'd phone me up at like midnight, and he'd say, "Chuck," because he used to call me Chuck Cecil. He said, "Chuck, have you got those figures?" And I want to say, "But Jeff, it's like midnight." But anyway, I was young and responded and getting it. And then I got invited out to the central offices, which were in Menlo Park, which is just down from San Francisco. And I remember, working away, and he said, "Chuck, it's Friday, it's boat time." I went, "But we've got all these figures." He went, "No." And he had what's called a cigarette boat. And the cigarette boats are the boats that the drug dealers use, because they have 2 5-liter engines.
Right.
And they'll go at about 100, 110, 120 miles an hour. And we went out on this boat into the bay, and it was unbelievable.
It's like
And
Miami Vice,
just like Miami Vice. And then afterwards, he took me for tequilas. We came into this enormous throbbing boat and stopped at a bar and bought me tequilas. And that was how I discovered how the other half live.
Yeah, and you do love a boat anyway, Charles. You're very at home on the water, aren't you? You're usually moving a little bit more slowly than that.
That's
Right.
true. Dave, bless him, is referring to my rowing, which I am keen. So obviously, Dave, we missed out on that opportunity to meet in San Francisco, and as you say, we then met again. Revolution, we'd written a game called Year of the Temptress, with initially a company called Mirrorsoft, which was owned by Robert Maxwell, who was a newspaper tycoon, whose daughter Ghislaine is obviously in the news at the moment.
Let's not go there, shall we?
So let's not go there. But he was not the most honest of men. I don't think I'll get sued for saying that.
I think that's...
And his company collapsed, and that allowed us to go to Virgin Interactive, with whom we had a long relationship. And then our second game, Beneath the Steel Sky, we had that commissioned, and I thought it would be lovely to work with Dave again, and to work with Dave, and probably phoned you up, I don't know, and suggested that you might want to work on the game, and I was absolutely astonished when you said yes.
Yeah, well, I think post Watchmen, I kind of could have done anything that I wanted, really, because it was so successful. But really, I decided that what I wanted to do were not things that were going to, be the path to great riches. But I had the opportunity to do things that I enjoyed, And my son was a huge gamer. I've never been a huge gamer. That end of it, I leave to people who know much more than me. But I sort of like the atmosphere of games, and I like the feeling that you and your team had. It reminded me very much of the best experiences that I've had in comics, where it's about collaboration and about just having fun with your friends, if you can manage to engineer that. And I thought that working on a game with you lot would be just the kind of thing I would enjoy. And I remember meeting up with 3 or 4 of you. I think it was in South London somewhere, and walking across a park and getting all enthusiastic about the possibilities of games and how they were similar in some ways to comics for the reasons that I've just mentioned. And indeed, it did turn out to be the case that it was a similarly enjoyable kind of experience. Where it was a small group of people working on something that you were, quite passionate about. And indeed, as it worked out, and I'll name no names, financially speaking, it worked out quite well for me as well, because I was told to go away and come up with a figure for what I thought I ought to be paid. But before I could suggest a figure, somebody from the publishers phoned up and suggested a figure to me, which I can now say was at least 3 times more than I was going to ask for. So I said, thank you very much. So that made the experience all the sweeter. But I'd have done it for less, as is the case, you know?
Yeah, well, not to name any names, but he was the head of development at the time.
There was
So
some, yeah.
And when you first came up to Hull,
Yeah.
I do remember, for those of you who are not aware, we in the north of England, we have trains called sprinters. And if ever there was a less appropriate name, it is this. And the Sprinter honestly has the most extraordinary history. The British government approached a car company, British Leyland, a bus company, and asked them if they could produce cheap trains. So they literally produced trains based on a bus. So the wheels don't turn. They just so what these horrible trains that really are buses do is they make the most appalling noise when they go around corners, because what the wheels are doing is actually, because they can't turn, is they're scraping against the rails. And Dave, that was presumably your first impression as you approached Hull on one of these sprinters.
Yes, it was more, not so much a sprinter, more a kind of an ambler or a lurcher. I think might be the word I would use. But yes, so I'd come up from the south of England, from King's Cross, which is the big terminus in London, on really quite a nice train with perhaps even a seat reserved. And I get to Doncaster, which is a huge railway interchange. And then, as you say, Charles, I get on this kind of cattle truck, and it would rock its way up to Hull. Which Hull is a wonderful city, and indeed my wife has many happy memories of when she used to live and work in Hull. But in those days, it wasn't the most prepossessing of places. Once you got off this sort of slightly, shambolic train and found yourself in the middle of, the north. But the Revolution offices were not far from the train station, and I knew that after you'd met me at the station, you were going to feed me well with the famous bacon butty, which I think we've talked about before. We have. But
it was so good that it's probably worth mentioning again, wouldn't you say, Dave?
But a really large, soft roll, a bap or a butty, as we call it over here, filled with really nicely cooked, very fatty back bacon. And after my somewhat, arduous journey, it was the perfect refreshment I needed. And then, powered by those and strong cups of tea, we would go and spend a couple of hours talking about the game and reviewing the story and looking at the artwork and everything like that. And then I'd reverse the whole thing and find my way back to London. It was a fairly long day. I'd have to start off at kind of 7 o'clock in the morning and probably wouldn't get home till about 11 or something like that. And we did it kind of, as I remember, once a month or something like that. But it was worth it, and it was a huge charge of excitement, and to be able to meet everybody and see what they were working on. Because obviously in those days we didn't have the benefit of teleconferencing. The highest technology we had was the fax machine, which, again, a little bit like the cattle truck going from Doncaster to Hull, would sort of chug the information out. You'd put it in and it would judder and judder through the thing very slowly at your end, and then slowly judder out at the other end. And so that was about the limit of the technology. I mean, we have spoken before about the technology that we used to actually produce the graphics for the game, which were kind of state of the art at the time, but it was basically an Amiga computer and a rather antiquated graphics program called Deluxe Paint, in which I would assemble all the characters, the characters' sprites, their little figures, kind of 1 pixel at a time. Change the color of 1 pixel, go and stand over the other side of the room, so it looked like, change it a bit more, change the color of the one next to it. So it was a really interesting kind of lo-fi way of doing graphics. But I've always enjoyed a challenge, and I think some of the sprites we came up with a lot of help from your graphics guy at Revolution, actually worked quite well. And as far as the backgrounds were concerned, they were even more low tech. I would basically draw them all out in pencil on typing paper. And then we'd scan them, and an animation background artist called Les Pace would hand color everything using watercolors. And we'd then scan that into the computer and marry it up with a little depaint sprite. So it was quite the whole thing, from the travel, the food, up to the actual technology was, from a different age, I think it would be fair to say.
But obviously at the time it felt extraordinary. The Amiga, the resolution was 320 by 200, which felt enormous, and you could display a whole 16 colors from a palette of 512 colors.
Hundreds of colors.
I mean, and that's what I think is interesting is people look at the style, and a lot of people are very look back nostalgically. But the style and all that sprite style was very much dictated by the limit of the graphics rather than any other reason. But I think it's. Do you remember the person you're talking about? The sprite artist was a fellow called Steve Oates.
Yes.
And Steve, when we started trying to pull the team together, Steve, we put an advert in the local paper. And we got the most amazing people. Steve was working as a clerk at a company called Kalamazoo. And he came in and he had a passion for animation. I have no idea where he learned it. He had no formal training whatsoever, but he was brilliant. Then we had a background artist that we pulled forward. Steve had joined us for Lure of the Temptress. A background artist called Les Pace. Sorry, not Les Pace at all. I'll remember his name in a minute. I've forgotten. And obviously we had Tony Warrener, who was one of the programmers with Dave Sykes. And then Steve Ince came a little later as the producer, I believe. So it was and then Noreen, of course, was one of the founders as well. So it was a very sort of tight team. Yeah. But it was extraordinary that we managed. I mean, and Dave Cummins, of course, as well. Yeah. Do beg his pardon. Dave had been a tester at Activision, and he was so eclectic and well read and intelligent. And he started, writing bug reports that were so much better written than the games themselves. And it kind of, I find the whole thing rather embarrassing that he was able to do this. So, I brought him up to Hull, and he was terrific.
Yeah, I mean, it always struck me, and I would include myself in this, that we were quite an eccentric bunch. We had different skills and different backgrounds. But once we came together on this particular project, our different skills and our different experiences were, somehow strangely worked. And I think that's always been the thing I've felt about the games as well, not just the Steel Sky games, but Broken Sword as well. There's a really quite eccentric sense of humour and variety of approaches and flavours to it. I mean, with the Steel Sky stories, I mean, we've always known and believed that they take place in Australia, but there are people there who have got broad Yorkshire accents or kind of strange English names and a peculiar sense of humour and cultural references. And I think that's what makes them so interesting, actually, that they're not the usual mix. Things seem more or less normal, but then there's weird little corners of it where they feel very personal and very much like kind of in jokes and things that we found amusing at the time and we don't feel the need to explain. So I think they've got that lovely kind of handcrafted feel rather than being edited by a committee. They're sort of the kind of strange offspring of eccentric people.
I think the world, of course, is a futuristic melting pot of lots of different people from different races, creeds, and then somehow, I mean, the reason, by the way, I need to say a shout out also to Adam Tween, because Adam was the background artist who was absolutely brilliant. And that was the last member of our very close knit. But the reason that this happened, Dave, and I've said this before, but I'll repeat it, is that the game appeared on 15 Amiga discs. And people kind of celebrate that now. But at the time, if you played it, you'd have to keep swapping these discs. I mean, it must have been a nightmare, particularly if one of the discs was corrupt. But this new format called the CD, the compact disc, had just come out. And obviously going from 1 meg to 300 meg revolutionized everything. And Virgin came to us and said, you know, there's this talk that we're going to be able to put voices. And we thought, that's great, we'll do the voices. And so nobody had any idea. And a friend of my sister's was in the Royal Shakespeare Company. And he said, oh, I can organize it. I've got a friend who's got a studio. This will be fine. Don't worry. Just turn up and, you know, I'll make sure it's all fine. Give me the script. So I kind of assumed that having given him the script, he would have all of these actors ready. So we turned up at 10 o'clock and there was only him. And he said, oh, no, they're all going to arrive soon. And one by one, these sort of disheveled actors walked in. None of them had got any idea what they were doing. And we managed to get an hour or two in, and they were all a bit wild and wacky. But then come lunchtime, he said, right then, we're all off to the pub. Do you want to come? And I said, no, not really. You're not going to be long, are you? He went, no. Anyway, 2 or 3 pints later, they return, and clearly slightly worse for wear. And he says, all right, we're not quite ready to start. Lads, who wants to go upstairs for a little smoke? And I'm looking at him. I'm going, you can't do that. And he goes, no, it'll be fine. It'll be fine. Anyway, the lunacy of the characters were drug and alcohol induced. And unfortunately, we did actually have to I mean, it was so crazy that when we gave it to Virgin in America, they came back and said, we don't understand any of these voices. What on earth's going on? So we had, for the more extreme ones, we had to re-record them completely from scratch, which actually worked quite well, because it became a great, it hit the whole Daily Mail, printed the story. And it was such a good story that Radio 1 picked it up and ran with it, which was great because it gave a lot of publicity to the game.
Yeah, I'd like to make it clear that our creative vision was fueled only by bacon and tea.
Exactly,
there were no
yes.
substances involved at all. I shudder to think what would have happened if they had been.
Oh, I know. Yes. Yeah. So one of the things I was going to then talk about, Dave, is if you remember when we were writing the story together, all of the sort of inspiration went in. And again, I've talked about this before, but it was a really interesting period, the early 1980s. You know, the Cold War had the early 1990s, I beg your pardon. The Cold War came down, or the Berlin Wall came down in 1989, I believe. And do you remember the feeling of optimism? The war had been won. You know, there was going to be peace in the world forever.
Yeah, I mean, I think I can clearly remember the sort of mid-80s, which was when we were doing Watchmen, was a period of great fear. You know, it seemed very likely that there would be a thermonuclear war. There were programs on the TV. There was a thing called Threads, which showed how fragile things were and how quickly everything would end if there was a thermonuclear war. So I think maybe the early 90s was a kind of the relief from then discovering that wasn't going to happen, that there were going to be horrible things happening. And in society, there was still pretty horrible things happening, but at least we weren't all going to die in a sudden flash. And, you know, we've spoken about the kind of political aspects of these things before. I don't think I've ever set out deliberately to do something which is a political statement, but inevitably, if you're commenting honestly and you're creating honestly in the atmosphere of your times, these themes sort of find their way in. And I think what found its way into Beneath the Steel Sky was this feeling of a dystopia, this feeling of a fairly brutal, industrialized unsociety almost. You know, there was that famous Margaret Thatcher quote, which we've spoken about before, there is no such thing as society. You know, that feeling that there was no question of supporting other people, that we were all on our own, you know. And certainly that was something that I think we spoke about and thought about a bit when we were concocting Beneath the Steel Sky.
But then the other thing, of course, is that when you write characters and you design locations, obviously you can only draw on things that you know about. And I was actually sponsored when I left school in 1980. I was sponsored by Ford and spent the next year traveling around. They even sent me to Bordeaux, which was fantastic, to drink all that wine. But it was to a a gearbox factory, and these enormous great lathes cutting out metal and presses and everything. And so the beginning in this sort of dystopic world, I'm afraid, came straight out of Ford. But I remember, people would go, "Oh, I'm so busy," and they had very, very little to do. So Lamb, the factory owner, we turned him to a Yorkshireman, but he was actually based on all of those wonderful characters at Ford who would have a view of the world that they were absolutely sure was right. And I don't know if you remember Lamb, but he was
with the fur coat.
With the fur coat made of the last beavers. He's very proud of the fact that it's the last beavers and they're now extinct because they all exist in his fur coat. And I think we ought to apologise to all the good folk of Yorkshire, because why was Lamb a Yorkshireman? I mean, why? It's just not fair, is it? I mean, Yorkshire's a great county. It shouldn't have people like Lamb associated with it.
Well, true, I guess, but I mean, Yorkshiremen have also got a reputation of being very canny, no nonsense businessmen. So I suppose it's kind of a backhanded compliment, but no, it's really interesting to see the odd mix of characters that we ended up in. Some obviously were caricatures of actual people, some were generic, but they were all a little bit surprising, because real characters, real people are never that predictable, So I think that thing that you didn't, he's a Yorkshireman, I wonder what he's doing here in post-apocalyptic Australia. How the hell did that happen? I just think it adds interest to it, and it's stuff you couldn't imagine in a way,
I do remember when you go to the first when you go to Lamb's factory, it's actually a pipe factory. And it was going to be something else, but then this story broke, which was so brilliant, from a Sheffield company called Forge Masters, that claimed that they were making pipes to send to Iraq, and actually what they were doing was producing pipes that could be turned into super guns.
Yeah,
and the British government, started to sue them until it turned out that the British government had been coaching them on how to sell it to Iraq in the first place. It was all absolutely insanity.
And you can't invent stuff like that, can you?
You can't invent stuff like that because it's so ludicrous. So that all of that fed into the idea of the game and what was happening in the early 90s and how crazy all of these things were.
Yeah. It was. Go on.
I was just going to say, because the other thing was that, of course, we talk about the fact that it's in Australia, and it was, but we were trying to hide that. And do you remember what we wanted to do was invert? And I think it was you that was keen to do this. Invert the society so that the people who were poor lived at the top and in the smog, and the people who were rich were living at the bottom, which is obviously the reverse of what you would have expected.
Yeah, I don't know if it was me that came up with that, but I'm quite happy to accept the credit for it. But because I do think, in the standard dystopic thing, it's a bit like the H.G. Wells things. There's the Morlocks who are labouring away down in the tunnels and in all the filth and the detritus. And then as you rise towards the lovely blue sky, it gets nicer and nicer and nicer, and the rich people live at the top. And I think to invert that, again, gave it a really interesting feeling because, it ran counter to what you had seen in these kind of things before. It also, when you looked at the skyline, you could see where all these pipes were being used, because it was nothing other than a forest of kind of chimneys and ducts and drains and things like that. So I think that gave it quite a distinctive look and made it a little bit unusual. I mean, I've always enjoyed creating worlds anyway, and I think that was kind of one of the reasons behind you approaching me, that in something like Watchmen or a lot of the other things I've done, the setting is as much a character as the characters are, and if you get the right look for the setting and make that interesting enough, then you've given the reader something extra. You've given them an interest not only in the actors but in the stage as well.
Well, one of the things, and again, we owe a great deal of gratitude to Adam Tween and Steve Oates, because the limits were extraordinary. If you think of the first screen, it's got that blue feel. When you go outside, it's got that rusty red. And I think working with you and working with Les Pace, there was clearly this sense of how do we paint it so that it will work in the 32 colors, or maybe it was 64 colors, but very, very few colors. And that meant that there was actually a really strong color theme that ran through each location, which I think was important for the story, but as I say, was brought about because of the constraints of the system rather than necessarily being a deliberate approach.
Yeah, I remember one other thing that we did as well, which we felt was a bit of an innovation, was to have foreground objects so that you wouldn't just have this sense of just a stage with the characters walking up and down with no real depth, because that was the one thing we couldn't do, was give the characters depth, because they could only move in a flat plane. But we found by having really strong, heavy foreground objects, we could imply a sense of depth and the fact, and make it feel like they were in a three-dimensional space. And we even at one point in the pipe factory, where Foster has to walk down some steps and get smaller, we couldn't actually scale the sprite. So he walks behind this big piece of machinery as a full-size sprite, and then walks out a bit further down as a half-size sprite. And it worked amazingly well. You could believe it because you believed in the perspective and the sense of depth. So again, it's a sort of creative challenge I've always really, really enjoyed, where there are restrictions, because, you know, that really puts you on your mettle to be creative. And it was things like that that gave me a great satisfaction. I mean, I would also have to say that before I get into the comics thing, I trained as a building surveyor. So I do understand how buildings are constructed. I do know how big a window is, how thick a wall is, you know, and I think that was a tremendous help with designing these backgrounds. And also, after all my years of drawing comics, I've got sort of an instinctive feel for perspective, you know, for the way things get smaller as they go towards the background. So all those kind of aspects, I think, helped with the realization of it. And I think, you know, again, not only did I enjoy doing it, but I think designing the game made great use of my personal skills, my ability to draw, my ability to tell stories, and also my ability to design environments. So I did find it was a really fulfilling experience. I mean, the thing that I couldn't take any credit for at all was the actual gameplay. And really, the gameplay is the crucial thing. That's what I've come to learn from my experience with you, and also talking to gamers like my son. You know, it's the gameplay that really matters. It can be the best graphics, the most intoxicating backgrounds, but unless you enjoy playing the game, it's all wasted. So for all I'm giving myself credit for the design, I think it was the underlying structure of the game, which also, I mean, obviously informed what the sets had to look like, and also informed the way the story had to go, that I found, you know, that I was learning about a whole area that I didn't really know about before. So, you know, on every level, I look upon it as being a really creative and enjoyable experience that I was getting paid too much for as well, as I already mentioned.
And do you remember also that until you drew the kangaroo in the comic book, and we'll come on to the comic book in a minute, there was this sort of intention to try and hide the fact that it was Australia. And I got really excited that they had a King's Cross in, and of course you took the train from King's Cross when you came up to see us. They had a King's Cross, they had a St James's, they had all of these things. So we had an underground system, which of course you get to later in the game. And there was still this pretense that this was London's King's Cross, when actually it was Sydney's King's Cross.
Yeah, because I think, although, again, as you say, we didn't talk about it specifically, we kind of had this idea that Union City was built on the ruins, on top of the ruins of Sydney, which is where King's Cross was and all those things. And I had that in mind as a sense of the scale of the place as well. I mean, God forbid anything like that happens to Sydney, which I've been lucky enough to visit. And it's a wonderful city. And next to Hull, it's one of my favourite cities in the world, actually. No, I do really love Sydney. But when we did plant a few clues, and I'm sure there are people who played the game, particularly people who actually lived in Sydney, who thought, hold on, St James, King's Cross, you know, this is ringing some strange echoes, you know. So again, that's the kind of stuff that I know as a consumer of fiction and imaginative works, I really love when you find a couple of clues for yourself. And I think probably you know, that must have made some people smile to think, it is really Australia because this is actually Sydney, you know.
Well, there's a friend of mine from Middlesbrough, and he says that if you go to the Sydney Bridge, Sydney Harbour Bridge, that it all came from Middlesbrough, and every single one of those plates has got Middlesbrough
Yeah,
stamped across it. So, and Middlesbrough, of course, by extraordinary coincidence, you know, is where our art director Sucha is from. So, you know, everything is cyclical.
everything connects. Everything connects. Just talking about the backgrounds and so on. Yeah, Les Pace, who did the hand colouring, he did an amazing job on it because he gave him such great texture and depth. You know, by laying that colour on top of my outline drawings. But I remember getting a huge thrill when I was up with you at Virgin offices in London, and they had a 20-inch Apple monitor, and that was by far the biggest monitor I'd ever seen. And they'd scanned in one of the backgrounds and got some sprites moving. And to see these things that were, you know, really drawn on small pieces of paper on a 20-inch screen with the light coming through them just really took them to another dimension. So I found that really, really thrilling. I mean, a 20-inch monitor now with a 4K display, I mean, we just take it for granted. But that was another step forward into thinking, oh yeah, this could be so much more. And indeed, that I'll let you tell this bit of the story. But when eventually we got even closer to Apple than having one of their monitors, the screen resolution that we'd done the game on actually was a great virtue, wasn't it?
It was, because I mean, this is jumping forward a lot, but the first iPhone resolution was roughly 320/200. It was around about that, which meant that it translated, you know, very well. But we'll come on to that.
Okay.
Talking about clues, Dave, do you remember the security manual that you created? You drew all of those characters.
Oh, the little portraits of the characters. Yeah. Yes, I do. Yeah, yeah.
And I really loved those, but there was one in particular that I liked, and that was Rat Girl.
Yeah, with the teeth.
And Rat Girl with the teeth. And, you know, a precocious young woman is how she was described, and always escaping from custody. And so and I know we're not talking about Beyond the Steel Sky, but I love the idea. I've always liked her as a character, and it was fantastic to be able to bring her back. Now, I'm not sure how obvious it was. I don't think we ever actually call her Rat Girl. We call her Raquel.
Oh, yeah, let's I'm just gonna jump in here and just express everyone's desire to not be spoiled by this
Oh,
video
okay.
for both of
No
the games
spoilers.
actually, because we have some people who either hadn't played it for so long they mostly forgot the story, or some newcomers even.
Okay.
So I gotta calm you two down.
Look out for characters from before.
Yeah.
And forget what I've just said about Raquel.
But what's interesting about the characters in that security manual, and it applies to Foster, our main character as well, is that they only existed as these fairly blocky little sprites. But with the comic book, I was able to do, you know, a real high definition, fully drawn, detailed, full color version of Foster and his companion Joey, so that when you saw the little sprites in the game, you sort of projected this sort of fully drawn, dramatic looking figure with a black leather overcoat and a, you know, good looking chiseled features and tall and muscular. You sort of completed the trick, which was that you thought, oh, this little thing that's scampering around the screen, that's actually that guy, and that's his super detailed robot. And I think with things like the character that you just mentioned, by only having one little drawing of them, you could imply their presence without having to draw them all the way through it. So in a way, it was almost the graphics in the original Steel Sky were almost like an impressionistic drawing where they implied as much as they actually showed. If that makes sense.
Well, that's interesting.
Yeah.
And talking of the comic book, that beautiful comic book that you created for the original game, he picks up a can, doesn't he?
He does. Yes.
A can of Foster's.
Foster's beer. Yes.
Foster's beer. He finds, or rather, his the shaman who rescues him after his helicopter crash. I don't think that's too much of a spoiler because that happens in the first opening moments of the comic book. Finds a can, and it's got Foster's written on it, which we thought was really clever.
Yeah,
because he says,
yeah, because
Sorry,
we've
go on.
established that they scavenge the city dumps and they bring back bits of metal to make things out of, which is why they've got this flattened beer can, which happens to be a very popular kind of Australian beer, doesn't it? So carry on.
And also because they fostered him. So it's like the double meaning.
Yeah, it makes perfect sense.
We thought it was so clever, and we thought that Foster's Beer would be delighted to have their name appear in a game. When they discovered, they were somewhat less than delighted. But to be fair to them, instead of coming after us, they just told us to change it, and they would look the other way. So we then had to change it. I can't even remember what we changed it into.
Well, that's very interesting, because when they first started to import Foster's into the UK, it was actually brewed in Australia, and I actually quite liked Foster's beer. But then they stopped importing it, and it was produced over here in one of our mega breweries, and the taste went completely off. So I think it's rather interesting that they changed the beer and we changed the reference. You know, it feels like some kind of payoff. You know.
Well, these days, of course, we'd be charging them huge amounts for in-game placements, but
well, sure, but no, as you say, it was perfectly justified anyway. He was Robert Foster because he'd been fostered by this tribe of dwellers in the outback. So whether it was Foster's beer or not, you know, it still worked.
Yeah, I think the fact that we used the same logo as there's the same lettering and the same colouring probably put us on thin ice.
All right, yeah, we did. I'll come quietly and plead for leniency. But we thought it was dead clever, and I still think it's dead clever. So,
yeah, and whatever it was, Billy Goat. I think we changed. I can't remember.
Billy Goat beer.
Billy Goat beer, and that probably had some clever Foster's connotation. I don't remember. Yeah. But one of the great moments I remember is where we were wrestling with the story. And it's so often the case, there's just something missing. I remember the eureka moment was somebody said, it's his dad. And it's never really happened in the same way. You go, nah. And then suddenly you think, and all of the problems, all of the sort of slightly jankiness, the clunky elements went, and it was, oh my God, it is his dad. It is his dad. And that explained all of those ideas of why the helicopter crashed. We said it's his mother trying to escape from his father. I won't give any more spoilers away. Otherwise, Wendy's going to be throttling me. So I think I better move on very quickly. Oh, but I was going to talk about some of the puzzles, but I can't talk about the puzzles. Dave, you were telling me earlier about the press tour, about when it was all finished.
Yeah. Well, of course. I mean, obviously, Charles wanted me aboard on the game, not only, you know, for my artistic and creative skills, but obviously my name being somewhat well known as a result of having worked on things like Watchmen and Doctor Who and 2000 AD and everything like that. My presence, I'm sure Charles thought, would be very useful to the promotion of the game. And I've always enjoyed doing that kind of stuff anyway. I mean, when you've worked on a thing for a long time, it's very flattering that people are interested to know about it. And it's also important that you get good coverage from the press. So Virgin Games arranged for me and Charles and a PR lady to go down to Future Publishing, who are, you know, a huge publisher of consumer magazines and games magazines. And in the car on the way down, the Virgin PR lady said to me, "Look, Dave," she said,
she was Woody, Danielle Woodyat.
Yeah. Anyway, she was a very pleasant woman, very high powered, but she was impressing on me. "Dave, we've got to make a good impression on these editors. We've really got to make a good impression. It's very important because good editorial coverage is worth more than any advertising you can pay for. So we've got to make a good impression, on them." So I said, "Okay, yeah, I'll see what I can do." So we arrived at Future Publishing down in Bath. I believe it was. And we
Yep.
walked into their building, walked into their kind of bullpen where all the editors sat in one big room. And as we walked in, I heard them whisper, it's Dave Gibbons, it's Dave Gibbons. And to a man, they pulled a copy of Watchmen out of their desk drawer and formed an orderly line in front of me. And I took my Sharpie out and dedicated their own personal copy of Watchmen to them. And the Virgin PR lady was kind of, wow. And then we went to lunch where I reeled out all my old comic book stories about working with Alan Moore and what DC Comics is like and all this kind of thing. And these editors who were all comics fans sat there absolutely rapt. You know, you could have heard a pin drop. They were the best audience that I've ever had. So in the car coming back, of course, Woody is absolutely ecstatic. Oh my God, Dave, I can't believe it. It couldn't have gone any better. Oh, you saw, and I didn't realize it was this whole thing. So what do you do? Do you do a lot of signing? I said, well, you know, we have these comic conventions and we sign books for people and do sketches and things. She said, could you sign copies of the game? And I said, sure, yeah, I'll be happy to do that. That would be a really good idea. She said, I'll fix it up. Anyway, a few weeks later, when the week the game was released, I find myself at Virgin Megastore near Hyde Park, part of the Virgin Games empire, or, you know, they're all in the same empire. And I roll up there and there's Woody and there's a table with a big stack of games behind it and some Sharpie pens and a chair. And she says, you know, that's where you're going to sit there and it's going to be great. And they're going to come in and you're going to sign copies of their game for them. I said, oh, well, that's great. So it was nearly 1 o'clock. So I sat down and she said, oh, everybody should be here in a minute. In fact, my boss is coming down because he's heard about you and he really wants to see the magic, you know. Anyway, so this guy comes down from Virgin and we're introduced to each other, and it's now 1:10 and they're the only people there. It gets to about 1:20 and it's getting really embarrassing. And the guy from Virgin says to Woody, oh, well, look, I'm afraid I've got other appointments to go. So I'll leave you to it. Hope it goes well. And Woody, bless her, managed to stay there with the embarrassment for about another 10 minutes and nobody had shown up at all. And she said, sorry, Dave, I have to go now as well. But I'm sure there'll be people on towards the end of lunchtime, because that's what normally happens. People have their lunch and then they come, you know, all these excuses. Anyway, I was scheduled to sit there until 2:30. So I'm sitting in the middle of the megastore with my Sharpie, haven't done a single signature. All the people walking past looking at me thinking, a bit strange, that guy's just sat there with a pen in his hand. Anyway, it's now getting to the point where I think, well, I'm probably going to go a bit early because obviously nobody's going to come. And this guy walked past in front of me with a shopping cart, and he obviously was off to Antarctica for a month or something like that because it was piled high with CDs and DVDs and games and, you know. And he stopped and looked at me and he said, he was German. He said, what are you doing? And I said, well, I'm an artist and I've helped design this game. And if you'd like a copy, I'll sign it for you. He said, okay, give me one. So I signed my name, gave it to this guy. He chucked it in his shopping trolley and walked off. And that was the only signature I signed. And it was, well, I've never had a signing where I've done so few as that. Then, of course, I discovered that actually it hadn't been advertised. So even my most rabid fan had no idea I was going to be sat in the Virgin Megastore. And but it was a good experience for me because it taught me humility. So I've obviously done signings where there's dozens of people. But to sit there on your own with a pen in your hand and nobody cares, it's very good for the soul. So I thank you very much, Woody, for that. It was a good experience.
Oh gosh, it's always the nightmare, isn't it? So, Dave, moving on. The game was a success. It went to #1 in the Gallup charts. It got some great reviews. We were very proud of the reviews, and we really have, I guess, 3 audiences that we bring forward: the people who loved it at the time, and we a lot of those people were, you know, at their formative ages of, you know, 15, 16, 17, one of whom, and I keep saying this, but, you know, we're really thrilled that our CTO, Joost Peters, was one of those. I don't know exactly how old, but he was 16, 17. And it kind of meant an awful lot. And there's a really hardcore of people who played it. And it really resonated with them at that particular age and at that particular time. And in those days with retail, a game got a few months, and then you could sell it on budget, and then it was gone forever. And we assumed that with Beneath the Steel Sky, because it was written in MS-DOS, that once it fell out of, it stopped being supported by retail, and then Windows stopped supporting MS-DOS, it was effectively dead. And I remember throwing away all the digital material. We kept the physical, we kept the paintings and stuff and the faxes, but all the digital stuff I remember just dumping, because I absolutely knew for certain that it was never ever going to be used again. And then a group called Scum VM formed, and they were passionate adventure fans. And it was a huge work of programming. They created an engine, a graphics engine, that they could then convert the source code to work. And 3 programmers came. One of them was Yoast, and 2 others, and they all loved Beneath the Steel Sky. And they took the source code from Revolution, and they actually ported it to work under the Scum VM, or within the Scum VM engine, which was extraordinary, because if that hadn't happened, then so many people would have never got to experience the game, and certainly wouldn't be Beyond the Steel Sky. So we're extraordinarily grateful to those guys. But so the first audience was the people who played at the time, then people who played it for free, because we decided to give it away for free. But then the third big audience was when we were contacted by Apple in about 2008, 2009. And they suggested that they thought that our adventures would work well on the new iPhone, which had only just come out, which you mentioned previously, which was at a very low resolution compared to now. And we ported the game, and it sold really, really well. We were absolutely thrilled. Apple got behind it, and it opened it up again to a new market. And what I wanted to talk briefly about was, even after all of those years, after 20 years, people were still talking about Beneath the Steel Sky. And I don't know, you may or may not have similar anecdotes, but the one that I remember particularly well was in about 2015, being asked to go to Uruguay, which was so exotic, because Uruguay, I hardly knew where it was in South America. And
South America,
it is, yes. The river, I can tell you, it's the River Plate.
Yes.
And sorry,
Graf Spee, wasn't that where that was sunk?
Oh yes, yeah.
Sorry to digress, everybody. But
yeah, no, and I came and
love a boat.
Yeah, and these wonderful people of Uruguay told me that Uruguay was a British invention. We didn't like the idea of Brazil and Argentina holding the power over the River Plate or Plate. And so we invented Uruguay as a country to break the balance. Anyway, the point being that when I mentioned that Revolution written Beneath the Steel Sky, this cheer went up from these guys who were like 20 in their 20s, and it was just incredible that it felt to me that at the time we thought it would all be gone and forgotten within a couple of years, and yet 20 years later, more than 20 years later, there was still this love for the game, which is why I then approached you a couple of years later and asked about Beyond the Steel Sky. Now, Wendy's probably going to jump in and stop us from talking about this, but briefly. Is she?
No, I was just going to say something. What you just described, I think that's the wonderful thing. It's true in comics fandom, and it's true in games fandom as well. That there is no great dividing line between the fans and the professionals, as it were, because you're talking about basically a group of fans kept Beneath the Steel Sky alive just for the love of doing it, and that there are people all over the world who also love it. And it's always surprising when you go to somebody out of the way and you find that something you did years before still matters to these people, in the way things that you loved when you were growing up still matter to you. And that's happened in comics as well. People have released their archives and they found source material from the past that fills in the beginnings of things that are well known today. And it's wonderful to be a part of that people from all over the world and have got all sorts of different talents are united in their love for a particular thing, be it a comic, be it a game, be it a TV program. And I think that's one of the things that really attracted me to getting involved with games with you, that I sensed that it was that same kind of community, which is, a great thing to be part of.
Well, we are blessed. And Wendy, I'm going to ask if we've got any questions that want to be asked, but it is a huge privilege to have created games that people are so passionate about. It's an incredible, it's just wonderful. And of course, Watchmen, I mean, we were in New York together, weren't we, in September, October? I don't remember.
Yeah, 20.
And and walking around and seeing these, big Watchmen billboards, I felt proud to be walking with you in this incredible, this incredible celebration of a comic book that was more than, probably 30 years old at that stage. I would think at this stage.
Yeah, and of course it's always, it's always amazing to see something that you sat in your little room, be it in my home or in your studio, where you've created so many games. They go from being something that's very everyday and very small scale to suddenly, yes, people all over the world are playing it. Yes, you walk down Broadway and there are huge kind of signs with your work on it. And it's a wonderful thing, that you can transmit that enthusiasm to so many people these days. I think I'm
brilliant.
All teary-eyed now, Charles. But no, but it's
before we both blub.
Yeah,
Wendy, are there any questions that you feel might be valuable to throw at us?
Yes. Let me first check. Kira, you can hear this, right? Do you have time for us to go a little bit over time here? Because, yeah. Okay, awesome. You guys can't hear her. Yeah, wonderful. Let's get into some questions. Great. So somebody asked, could I ask what the influence of Beyond the Steel Sky were? Any Asimov in there?
Well,
Go on, Dave.
There is a famous Isaac Asimov novel called The Caves of Steel, which I think is about robots, isn't it? I did read it, but it was many, many years ago now. It's hard to say where ideas come from or what inspires you to kind of do things. And I could see Asimov as being an influence on me. I also think of the French artist Mobius and stories that he's drawn. I think of things like Blade Runner, I think of things like what's a real favorite of ours, the Terry Gilliam movie Brazil, which has got a lot of elements in it that we find very inspirational and amusing. But I think the thing is to add your own twist to it. And that's what I'm pleased we were able to do, was to do something that was perhaps inspired by things we'd seen in the past, but had its own, really unique flavor.
Well, there is a line. There is a line in the original where Foster says to Joey, "But that breaks the laws of robotics. It's Asimov's laws of robotics." Mm-hmm. To which Joey replies, "That's just a novel, Foster." So there are mentions of it, and that's fantastic. The other thing, of course, is the novel 1984, which was so extraordinarily amazing at the time, and trying to tell a story of today and looking at what's going on, looking at things like what's going on in China with social credits, all of those sorts of things.
Mm-hmm. Somebody has a cool question. What language is the PC version of your game currently written in? So I think this applies to both Beneath the Steel Sky and Beyond the Steel Sky.
Right. So for Beyond the Steel Sky, we use an engine called Unreal Engine, and that uses a program system called Blueprints. And so people write in Blueprints, but if you wanted to go below the Blueprints, then you write in C++. As far as the original game is concerned, That was probably C++ as well. I don't remember.
But they don't mean the
Could have
actual
been.
language, English, French, Spanish, German. That wasn't the question, was it?
No. I think they meant programming languages.
okay.
Yep.
Is C++ that old? I mean, no offense.
Do you know, I don't remember. No, actually, do you know what? It was written in machine code. You're absolutely right. It was written in machine code, which was 68,000. The original games that we wrote for the Spectrum just a few years earlier were in Z80, and the Commodore 64 was 6502, and then this was a new language, which was 68,000, I think. Yeah, written in assembly language, and an assembly language. You know, if you write at a high level language, what it is it's very inefficient. And what this does is it interprets and goes right down to the metal, so you can get the most out of your computer. And you know, Tony in particular just had an instinct for machine code. It was kind of what he was brought up on. A whole generation. In fact, I'll tell you, a whole generation of British programmers did, because we had the Sinclair Spectrum way before anybody else, and we had so little memory that actually we wrote really tight code. And that meant that British programmers and became very, you know, were extremely advanced from a global perspective. And the government were very, with the foresight, they actually created it as on the educational curriculum, and that drew in a lot of girls as well. So it became a very diverse. And then Tony Blair's government decided to scrap computer programming because they thought it was too hard, and replaced it with ICT, information computer technology, which was such an act of vandalism. And it meant that nobody quite noticed. And then about 6 or 7 years later, the number of people applying for computer science just dropped off, and people worked out that this ludicrous decision by the government had actually destroyed this strong base. And then the government a few years ago reversed it and put computer science back in again. But had they not got rid of computer science at the time, we would be so far ahead of everybody else. It's quite extraordinary. Anyway, sorry, I'm being very negative here.
No, I just wanna hear none of it when you guys come at us with this game as being political. We're literally called Revolution. None of that, okay?
You got it.
Yeah, so we have some interesting questions. Some of them I think might be lost to time. One of them is, why does Lady Piermont appear in 2 different games?
Because we loved her so much. Because we loved her so much.
Is she based on someone?
No, but she was. Do you know? Was she played by Hazel? She was definitely played by Hazel Ellaby in Broken Sword. And I'm wondering whether she was also played by Hazel Ellaby in Beneath the Steel Sky. And we brought her back. I don't remember. This was such a long time ago. It's very difficult to remember the details.
I think it's really good when you do a sequel, not to get the whole cast back on, but just to have a couple of them, just as a nod. And the thing about her was she's a very proactive character. She really moves things forward, and she's really very definite and very clear in her motives. You know, that's how I feel about her.
I love that some of the fans are asking these really in-depth questions, and the answer from Charles when I DM him about it, I'm like, hey, somebody emailed us this really incredible question. And he's just like, you know what? That was like 20 years ago. I have no clue.
To be fair, 26 years ago.
Yeah, exactly. So somebody asked a really interesting question that you probably could go on forever about. So I'm asking you to keep it quite like under 3 minutes. But why 3D? Why not just stick to 2D? What was the moving catalyst for that?
Shall I start that one off, Dave?
Yeah, although I was going to say, I mean, you know, Charles had got me on board because of the skills I demonstrated as a comic book artist, and we did have the comic book that was the kind of preamble to the first game, that was the scene setter, and we wanted to do the same thing with this game. And we thought, wouldn't it be great if the whole game looked like a comic strip? In other words, if we could somehow emulate the drawn look of a comic. And Charles and his team came up with a really clever toon renderer, which meant that everything could be rendered in 3 dimensions, but it would have a kind of key line like you get in a comic, a darker line around everything. And we did some tests on that, and I thought, this is amazing. This really looks like a moving comic. And so we had a very smooth transition. In fact, it was a transition that worked in reverse. We established the look of the moving comic and then kind of distilled the opening comic from that. And so the whole thing, I think, looks as if it's kind of hand drawn, and it gives it a more interesting look than if it was done in a fairly just anonymous CG render. So I think that was part of the rationale behind that, as I recall it, Charles.
Yeah, no, very much so. So that's from an aesthetic perspective. From a gameplay perspective, what I was keen to do was carry forward the idea of what we had called virtual theatre. And that was the idea that the world, and Wendy will kill me if I talk about the specific, but there is a puzzle in Beneath the Steel Sky where you subvert the link system, and that has an effect on the character, and the character behaves differently because of what you've done. And that really excited me as an idea. And when we started thinking about Beyond the Steel Sky, it was going back and considering what were the puzzles that we felt worked. Now, the thing with adventure games is that you have a limited inventory. Sorry, you have a limited armory. You have the inventory, the things that you're carrying. You can use them on people or hotspots. You can talk to people. There's a limit, and people made the puzzles last by just basically making them obscure. And one of the things that our games we've tried very hard to do is to interweave the story with the puzzles so that the puzzles are logical within the context of the story at that particular time. So I felt that if we could bring back virtual theatre, if we could subvert the system, then we could actually transcend the puzzles and put point-and-click puzzles on top of that. But the problem with virtual theatre is that as characters walk around, if you've got 2D screens, then you don't know where they are. They could be that way, they could be that way, they could be somewhere over there. And if you follow them around here, they might be following you round and round. And that happened in our first game, Nearer the Temptress, and then to an extent with Beneath the Steel Sky. So by having a full 3D, you could look around the world and we could create arenas with characters that moved around, and then they responded to you as the player character subverting the world by going into the Internet of Things and changing the logic. And so that was what we wanted to do. We wanted to get the best of every world. We wanted the comic book look, and any frame could have been drawn by a comic book artist was our vision. But then the flexibility that we had of a 3D system.
That's a really good answer.
That was more than 3 minutes though, wasn't it?
It's okay. I was giving you 6 in my head, so it's fine. There is somebody asked about the voices. So character voices, was there any original voice actors from BAS 1? And if not, how come?
Right, because after 26 years, people sound very different. Well, they just do. They just do.
I mean, it's my entire life, I believe you.
Sorry?
It's my entire life, I believe you.
Right.
Well, so that just proves it. I'm sure you talk completely differently than you did 26 years ago.
I learned quite a few skills, yeah. Yeah.
Well, indeed, you are indeed living proof. So the reason, and it was something that we really, really wanted to do, and it is something that we talked about and we explored. But you know, after all that time, people just sounded very different, and it felt truer to actually get somebody who, you know, was younger, that was the age that Foster is 10 years later, rather than trying to read. So no, we didn't use any voice. I don't think we used any voices from the original. It was something that we really wanted to do and something that we took very seriously, but in the end we didn't.
Yeah, sorry. What were the inspirations for the design for Foster between Beneath the Steel Sky, Monkey Island 2, King's Quest 6? I started to think all adventure game characters had to wear long jackets.
Well, I I suppose that was the thing of the time, wasn't it? I don't know when The Matrix came out, but this kind of long leather coat thing was kind of the look almost.
The duster for the main
I think,
character.
Dave, I think you're doing yourself down. I think you created the look. I don't think the look
Maybe it
existed until people played Beneath the Steel Sky. I think, in fact, I think the Wachowskis will have probably played Beneath the Steel Sky and copied Foster for.
Well, you know, I have an idea that probably we were out before the Matrix trilogy, so that
Oh, we
may
were, yes. Oh, yeah, definitely.
well be the case. But yeah, but I mean, when it came to the second game, we kind of obviously Foster was now 10 years on, and even a really cool leather coat starts to look a bit distressed after 10 years in the Australian outback. So although he's got kind of the same outfit, he looks more weathered and it looks slightly more functional, and it's kind of more textured than the really cool sleek look that he originally had. And again, that fits in with the idea that, you know, 10 years of time has elapsed in that world, I think.
Yeah.
If we were totally honest, Dave, we would say that Tom Hardy was also somebody that we referenced, but in the second one, but in the first one, Dave, don't you remember when it was Australian? You introduced the idea of Dryzerbone as a jacket. I remember I'd never even heard of it, and it was your idea.
Do you know, Charles, you're absolutely right. It was kind of in black leather, but yes, there is like it's an Australian stockman's coat, which has got a double layer of material on the shoulders for the rain to run off, and is long to protect your legs and your knees and everything from the sheep or whatever it is you're hurting. So that's absolutely right. I will take credit for that. It was based on an Australian Dryzerbone stockman's coat. Very inspired, if I might say so.
It was, but definitely everybody else copied us. It wasn't the other way around.
Yeah, you're right, Charles. You remember it more accurately than me. We started it all.
Of course you did. Okay, so this question I like quite a lot. It's a little bit offbeat, but are you happy with the reception this game has received? I love it. Said what? Punkster. So that yeah.
Let me say that the people who enjoyed the game and had a good experience have really loved it, and it's been incredible reading people's comments. There were some bugs, as people know, and we are working really, really hard and have pretty much fixed them. And there are patches going out. And I apologise to people who did encounter those bugs, but for people who didn't, then it seems that the game went down really well, and that's just thrilling.
Yeah, it seems like a lot of people actually were able to play the game completely okay, and we're so happy that they got the experience that we designed for this game. And to those of you who are still waiting for some updates, right now people are still working. That's why we're a skeleton crew on stream. We had a lot more people planned, but we thought it would be wiser to use that time working out some more kinks. But we're hoping, if everything goes well, that this week might be a week that we can improve the game a little bit further, and latest next week. But this is not a promise. It's just giving you an ETA. Yeah.
and people have been absolutely brilliant, and we are aware. So to answer your question, I'm really thrilled at the reception. Thank you so much to everybody, particularly those who've enjoyed it and then posted reviews on Steam. That's just great, and thank you. I mean, one of the things I ought to also add is that because of COVID, we were unable to record the French and the German voices. They are being recorded at the moment. We're being very careful, very cautious about giving a date, because obviously we don't want to give a date and then let people down. But it is being recorded at the moment, so it is a few weeks off. And thank you to all those wonderful French and German people who are waiting patiently for the language in their own voices. Sorry, the voices in their own language.
Yeah, and I think you're gonna love the voices that Charles chose for you. We've been keeping close tracks on who gets to do what voice, and Charles is very, very much taking the lead on choosing and having the final word on that. And I've had a little look, and it's exquisite. It's really good.
Oh, brilliant.
Yeah. Wait, there was another cool one. Who comes up with all the jokes Joey says? He's hilarious in both games.
Do you know what? Do you know what? I think a lot of credit for Joey. Sorry, is there a really loud noise behind me?
No.
Oh, good. Good. Um, Kira, if you could ask them to wait a bit, that would be great. But what it was actually Matthew, who is one of the scripters, wrote a lot of those lines, and they're really fun and they're really funny. My feeling was, and some people are going to hate me for saying this, but my feeling is that the original Joey, the relationship was really fun. It was very much inspired by a film called Stand By Me, which was a lovely film from the 80s, that both Dave Cummins and I liked a lot. And that camaraderie was really important to the original game. But I thought that Joey was a little bit over rude. So, and apologies for people who think this is a heretical thing to say. And what I wanted from this was a little bit more of the camaraderie that we kind of anticipated for the first game. And yeah, as I say, Matthew stood, and the lines were originally written by Kevin Beamers. And Kevin is a terrific games designer and writer. I met him. My daughter Kira, who's actually hosting this stream, had played a game called Hector: Badge of Carnage, which is about this really gross policeman who wears Y fronts. You have to be a certain age to know what a Y front is, but they're very old-fashioned underpants that are really ugly. Big beer belly, and was always really rude about everything, and it was hilarious. And Kira had introduced me to Hector: Badge of Carnage, and I played it and really enjoyed it. And then by chance, I met Kevin in Northern Ireland, which is where he lives. And Kevin told me he'd written this game, and I was really impressed. And it felt to me like he would be the ideal person to write the dialogue, because it could be edgy without being offensive. That was our objective, never to be offensive, but at the same time to push the limit up to a line, whatever that line may be, and then not cross it. And Kevin wrote the initial dialogue for all these characters, and then Matthew absolutely took it, Matthew Kemp, and ran with it. So yeah, between the two of them, and then they were supported. Kevin was supported also by Neil Richards, who I've written with him for many years. So we had a really good group of people writing. But as I say, the initial was Kevin.
I think, having met Kevin, I think once or twice, he's a real kind of left field thinker. His thought processes are always astonishing to me. And I think the combination of his kind of fairly wild and edgy humor with the writing skills of the other people involved gives it that kind of, like how good American comedy is, because it goes through a writer's room and only the best ideas get through. I think that's kind of what Charles had there. And in all honesty, I would like to be able to, but I can't take any credit for any of that particular stuff at all. But I think Joey is a great character. And in one of the trailers you put out, his dialogue made me laugh out loud, even though I kind of knew it. Yeah, I think Joey has really come alive in Beyond. Yeah.
Yeah, it's true. I think part of that is because Charles, you are very good at trying to give up some of, or like giving other people a chance to shine. And I think that in the first game and in the second game, you both chose very young, laddish boys to have influence on Joey. And of course, that changes through the generations. So somebody who was back then 20, which isn't Matt like a baby? Isn't he like 24 or something?
He is.
Yeah.
He was. We grabbed him from the University of York, where he had just graduated in interactive media, and I've got a terrible admission that I've never told anybody, so keep this to yourselves. But the reason that the people who come from interactive media are so good for us is I designed the course. I was asked to work out what the employer would want. So I said, we've got to have programming, we've got to learn this, we've got to learn Photoshop, blah. And all these wonderful students are coming out of interactive media, and they're absolutely ideal for Revolution. But there is a reason why.
There's a pipeline. Charles said actually
Charles.
the pipeline for young programmers to come work at Revolution. I'm losing it. I'm sorry. That's so cute. But yeah, both Joeys are influenced quite well by this like lad culture but not toxic kind of humor, and I think that's why it's so current in both games and why it speaks to young men in both games. So I think that's
thank you.
amazing that you could give that up to somebody who is, you know, like who has this influence on Joey. And that's not easy to do when it's your baby, you know.
Thank you.
Yeah, Revolution. How come not many of the original characters reappeared in Bass 2? I don't like this question that much because, like I know you posted it a couple of times, but I don't like it as much because this would go into the spoiler territory. Does that make sense?
Okay, without wishing to give without giving any spoilers, the answer is that what we want to do is we want to make the world feel familiar, but we also want to make it feel fresh. So there are 3 or 4 characters that have appeared from before, but broadly is that balance, and you know, maybe we've got the balance slightly wrong, but if you have too many characters, then there isn't enough that's fresh and new, and if you have none, then there isn't the familiarity. So you've always got to build a balance between the two, and the only one that I rather miss is Hobbins. It would have been nice to see what happens to Hobbins. So if we ever do it again, if you guys are wonderful enough to support us and we have the opportunity to write a third, then I can promise you here and now that Hobbins will reappear.
And of course,
Dave, remind me of that.
I will. Of course, you don't have to have played the first game to play the second game, but if you have played it, your experience of these characters is all the richer because you sort of see them in their embryo form and what they've become. And so I think my feeling is there's just enough of that balance to tie the two games together without feeling that it's somebody going through their act again, you know?
Yeah, I started playing Beyond the Steel Sky the day that you hired me. And I didn't have any pre-existing attachments to the characters. And I was playing through the death build, and I was like, wow, this is so rich and so interesting. And then I started looking at playthroughs from Beneath, and I was like, oh my God, this has so much history. And then I wanted to go, I hadn't had time yet since we released, but I wanted to go back with this fresh lens. And I can't wait until like post-launch is calming down a bit. To do that. But as somebody with a fresh pair of eyes on the second game, I can guarantee you here and there, if you've not played the first one, this is going to enrich your experience a lot.
And it's going to be available in half an hour.
And it's going to be available in half an hour, which is I promised Kira.
We've talked our way right up until the actual release of it. There's only time for you guys to have a quick bathroom break and a drink, and you can get playing the game.
Yeah, on this note, your lovely daughter, who's hosting the stream, has a course starting at 7 p.m. So she also needs to book it there. So I promised her we'd kill the stream at 5:30. So
okay,
final question.
Gives us one last question. Brilliant. Well done.
All right. There was
Wendy, you are such a star. Thank you. As Kira.
All right. Question for Dave. What did you think of your comic being put in the game? The ones that you could run it. Was it the first time you saw your work with voiceover and SVX?
No, I mean, this has been a thing in the world of comics, this whole question of adding motion and sound to them. And I was involved, I still am involved with a company called Madefire, who do motion comic books. And it's a really interesting thing to read and also to create, because you have everything that you normally get in a comic, all the ways of telling stories, but you have a whole other level layered on top. So I did have some experience of working for them. And of course, there was also actually a Watchmen motion comic, which was rather unsophisticated. It had one actor playing all the parts, which meant that there were certain scenes in it that it sounded like a guy talking to himself. He was a very good actor, but it didn't quite work. But Madefire, who also assisted us with the motion comic that we made for Beyond the Steel Sky, have really got this whole process perfected. And it's wonderful to actually draw pictures and then see them come alive. And it's a really effective way of getting over the information that you need in order to start playing the game, and to segue very smoothly from a truly hand-drawn image into a computer-generated but still apparently hand-drawn image. But yeah, and there was a further level of things coming alive that I was thrilled at as well. Charles and his guys gave me a little demonstration of some scenes from Beyond a Steel Sky in VR on an Oculus rig, and that was amazing to actually be in the middle of things that you'd drawn. So yeah, I see these things as going on hand in hand, and they're all ways of telling stories, I think.
Quite true. Great. So, this is the final question because it's very, very short. What age is Foster in Beyond the Steel Sky? A gentleman never tells his age.
That's
30,
right.
30 something, 35, would you say?
Yeah, probably about 35. What's the longer answer to that is that obviously after 26 years, we wanted to draw a balance between something had to have changed, because if the sequel had come out the next year, then it would have been the same Foster at the same age. But we wanted to acknowledge that so much time had passed that Foster's life would have changed. So as 10 years later, obviously Union City has changed completely. What's going on around in the situation, and that actually gave us the opportunity to, and this isn't a spoiler, but it gave us the opportunity, because Joey's left in charge of the city, it gave us the opportunity to say, well, after 10 years, things will have changed quite substantially. And that means we take you into a different city and a different game world. So the short answer is 35, and the long answer I've just given you.
Awesome. All right. We're closing in to Kira having to leave and us having to say goodbye. I just wanted to say a huge thank you for heading over to the Steam page, clicking on the link. Some of you have actually wishlisted it. We can't see wishlists until like a day later because that's when the system updates. But I can tell you've wishlisted because we're already on the upcoming featuring and tag pages.
Excellent.
So a lot of you must have done it. Thank you very much. I think it's really cool. Yeah, a half an hour until the game's out. 26 years ago it wasn't April 11th, 1994 that this game came out.
Could have been.
So it's almost
Probably.
exactly, I mean, July, Jesus Christ. Time has really passed. It was just April yesterday. But yeah, it's been real. We're having a lot of fun supporting Beyond the Steel Sky. We've been putting together a lot of resources. We've been spending a lot of our personal time as well on it, just making sure that the builds keep improving and we have more things to show you every time and every week that you log on. And I hope that Beneath the Steel Sky coming to Steam really enriches your experience, and maybe you could play it and then return with a new lens back to Beyond the Steel Sky.
Oh,
But yeah.
I would love to give some of the spoilers, but I won't.
You will not. Oh man, I think you guys should say the final words since you're so loved. The comments are so full of love. I'm going to pick out some very beautiful ones at the end and send them to you.
Please
But
do.
if I kept reading them to you, we would just be here all day, and you just touch your cheeks, going, "Oh my God, that's so sweet." That would be the stream.
Well, no, I just thank everybody for their support and their interest in this. It's always great when you've worked so hard on things to get them out in the real world and get feedback from people who love the whole genre, who love the whole idea of games. So I hope those of you who haven't played Beneath the Steel Sky, really enjoy it. And I hope obviously that you want to follow up the experience with Beyond the Steel Sky. Then you've got the full movie.
And all I would say is that it's such a privilege to be able to communicate and engage directly with our community, who are wonderful, and it is great, and it's a privilege to be able to write games that you guys like so much. So thank you.
Sorry, just typed out. Yeah, let's say the final goodbyes. Thank you very, very much.
Lovely. Thanks, guys. Thank you for listening.
Great.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.